The morning sunlight filtered through the lush green trees, illuminating each house nestled close together in the Maple Hill residential neighborhood. It was a place any family would dream of: small, cleanly paved roads, neatly trimmed lawns, and an unparalleled peacefulness. The Johnson family had spent months searching for the perfect home, and finally, they had arrived. The heavily loaded moving truck turned down the narrow street in front of house number 18. James Johnson, a tall man with neatly cropped hair, stepped out of the vehicle, his eyes gleaming with pride. Following him was his wife, Rachel, a woman with a gentle smile but a strong demeanor. Their 2 children, Michael and Emily, could hardly contain their excitement as they stepped out of the truck, their eyes lighting up when they saw the 2-story house with a large backyard. "This is it," James said, his voice warm but firm. "Our new home." Rachel smiled, gently patting his shoulder. "It's even better than I imagined, James. We finally have a place to call home." But just as they began unloading their belongings, James noticed a cold gaze from across the street. An older man, with silver hair and wearing a neat shirt, stood on the porch of house number 17. He had his arms crossed over his chest, his sharp eyes fixed firmly on the Johnson family. Not hiding his discomfort, James walked over and politely nodded in greeting. "Hello, sir. I'm James Johnson. Just moved in here with my family. It's a pleasure to meet you." The man didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, sizing James up from head to toe before speaking in a dry, clipped voice. "I'm Walter Harrison. You probably know this neighborhood is very quiet. I hope your family won't disturb that." James hesitated slightly at the pointed remark, but he kept his smile. "Of course. We also want to enjoy this peaceful environment." Walter didn't say another word, just gave a brief nod before turning and walking back into his house. The door slammed shut with a heavy thud. James stood there for a few seconds, a feeling of unease rising in his chest. The next morning, as James stepped outside to get the newspaper, he immediately noticed something unusual. The brand new mailbox, which had been carefully installed, was now broken. Fragments of wood lay scattered across the ground, creating a chaotic scene. "Rachel!" James called out, his voice tinged with anger. Rachel ran out of the house, still holding the dish towel in her hand. She saw the mailbox and couldn't hide her shock. "Who would do this? It's only our first day here." James crouched down to inspect it closely. The cracks and impact marks clearly indicated this wasn't an accident. Someone had intentionally vandalized it. He glanced over at the house next door, Walter's house. The curtain on the second floor was slightly swaying, as though someone was standing inside, watching. "This definitely wasn't an accident," James said, his voice firm. "I'm installing security cameras today. We can't let this happen again." Rachel placed her hand on his shoulder, gently offering comfort. "Maybe it's just some kids messing around. Don't jump to conclusions." But deep down, both of them knew this wasn't just a prank. The security cameras were quickly installed later that day. James wanted to protect his family, and he believed that having evidence would help him deal with anyone trying to cause harm. But just one night later, things escalated even further. The next morning, Rachel discovered that the family's garbage bag had been torn apart and trash was scattered all over the yard. Some hasty, sloppily written words in red paint appeared on the gate. "Go away!" Rachel was nearly in a panic when she saw the words, but James reassured her. "We have the cameras. I'll check them and figure out who's behind this." However, when James reviewed the footage, he realized the vandals were more clever than he had thought. They wore hats to cover their faces and moved quickly, never revealing their identities. James felt his blood boil, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'll stay up tonight. I won't let them keep threatening our family." As expected, that night, James heard strange noises coming from the backyard. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the light revealing a figure trying to break through the fence. The person turned and fled when the light shone on them, but James recognized the distinctive gait. It was Walter. James immediately called the police, but when they arrived, Walter denied all accusations, insisting that he had been inside his house all night and knew nothing about the incident. The officer simply took his statement and shrugged. "We'll investigate, but you'll need more direct evidence." James felt frustrated, but the lack of support only made him more determined. "Fine. If you won't help, I'll take care of it myself," Rachel anxiously asked him after the police left. "James, what's your plan now?" "We need to be better prepared," he replied, his eyes filled with resolve. "I won't let Walter drive us out of here." Rachel nodded. They both knew that a battle had just begun. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the Johnson home felt heavy. Although the sunlight still streamed through the windows, the air in the house seemed darker than usual. Everyone in the family sensed that something was wrong. Strange things had started happening, and they all feared that the worst was about to come. Rachel stood in the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee, but her eyes weren't on the mug. They were fixed on the window. From there, she could clearly see Walter Harrison's house, the man who had been making life difficult for her family. The quiet walls of the neighborhood today seemed to be breaking apart bit by bit. The peaceful atmosphere in the neighborhood was no longer the same. "James, we can't keep going like this," Rachel spoke, her voice low and anxious. "You can't just stand by and watch them do this." James turned around, his face still bearing the same resolve as always. But in his eyes, there was a hint of worry Rachel had never seen before. "Do you think I don't want to do something? I won't let them push us out like this." After clearing away breakfast, James set about reviewing all the footage from the security cameras. Over the past few nights, he had stayed up, but there had been no clear signs that Walter or anyone else had directly come to vandalize their home. Yet, the signs from before continued, and James couldn't ignore them any longer. After a brief phone call, he received advice from an old friend in the police force. "James, I understand how you feel, but if you want to take action, you'll need clearer evidence, not just scratches on the gate or a torn garbage bag. If you don't want to face something worse, you'll need a different strategy." James clenched his fists, a surge of determination rising within him. "I won't let Walter think he can control my life." That afternoon, James decided to confront Walter directly. He felt that he had been patient long enough and that it was time to stand up and protect his family. If he just sat back and waited for the police to help, they would probably never uncover the truth. As James drove through the narrow streets of the neighborhood, his heart pounded in his chest. Each stretch of road felt like a challenge, a battle to protect everything he loved. He stopped right in front of Walter's house, determined not to back down. Rachel looked at him with a worried expression. "James, are you sure you don't want to make a scene?" "I'm just afraid things will get worse." "I'm not here to make a scene. I just want clarity. Once and for all," James replied, then took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. Each step he took on the sidewalk felt heavy, the sound of his shoes lightly tapping on the pavement adding to the tension in the air. Walter stood on his porch, his eyes cold as ice. When he saw James, there was no surprise on his face. In fact, he even smirked, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Oh, Johnson, is something wrong? I thought you would keep your distance like everyone else," Walter said with a mocking tone. James clenched his fists. "I didn't come here to argue. Walter, I just want to ask you one more time. Who is behind all the things that have happened over the past few days?" Walter sneered. "How amusing. You surely don't believe a gentleman like me would do such petty things, do you? But I can't speak on something I don't know about." "Don't pretend, Walter," James said firmly. "I know it's you behind all of this, but I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want you to understand one thing. If you keep messing with my family, I won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to protect them." There was a long silence before Walter turned back to look at James. His expression was no longer amused. "Don't play games with me. If you know what I'm doing, then you don't understand me. I'll do whatever it takes to protect this neighborhood." James didn't respond, but the feeling inside him was clear determination. He knew that this battle had just begun. A few days after the confrontation with Walter, strange events continued to happen. Although there were no overt actions from Walter, every time James left the house, he felt as if someone was watching him. The quiet footsteps in the dark, the fleeting shadows outside the window, all of it made him feel like his family was living in an unsafe house. One weekend morning, when James returned from work, he noticed something strange. The front door was locked, and a small piece of paper was stuffed into the crack of the door. James hurriedly opened it and read the hurried, scrawled message, "Get out now, or I'll make you regret it." His heart raced as he read the threat. He couldn't allow this to continue. After calling the police, he quickly decided that decisive action was needed. "Rachel, I can't take this anymore. I have to find a way to end this," James said as he prepared to head out. Rachel looked at him, worried but also unable to hide the determination in her eyes. "I understand. You've been patient long enough. But we need proof. Without it, things will only get worse." James nodded. "We need to gather enough evidence to get rid of him, once and for all." The next day, while the family was trying to start a normal day, James couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. He knew Walter wouldn't stop, and this time, he was determined not to let things get worse. By midday, when James and Rachel went out to grab lunch, they noticed Walter's car parked right in front of their house. Even more alarmingly, James's front door was no longer intact. Everything had been disturbed. The garden table was knocked over, and some items were damaged. At this point, James felt a surge of anger stronger than ever. Unable to sit still, he decided to bring the matter to light, even filing a lawsuit if necessary. But when he checked the security cameras, this time, he had captured the scene he had been hoping for. Walter standing near his front door, discarding something in the yard before quickly walking away. James immediately contacted the police and presented the new evidence. "Finally, I have proof," he said as he sat in the office with the chief of police. Now he can't deny it anymore. The next day, James and Rachel continued to live in a tense atmosphere. Although they had evidence from the security cameras, that didn't mean they would easily achieve justice. Walter was not an easy man to defeat, and with the power he held, James couldn't be sure how long this battle would last. While James was reviewing the video footage from the cameras and preparing documents for his meeting with the police, Rachel decided to visit her mother, Emma, who had always been a great source of comfort for her in difficult times. Emma lived in a small town not far from the city, and this time, Rachel decided to bring her daughter, Sophie, along to spend some time with family. As they arrived at Emma's house, the atmosphere in the village was completely different from the bustling city they had just left behind. The small, peaceful village, filled with flower pots, made Rachel feel a deep sense of nostalgia. This was the place where she and James had once dreamed of a peaceful life, free from threats and tension. Emma looked at Rachel with a gentle but concerned gaze. "You look tired, my dear. What's going on?" Rachel nodded, running her fingers through her hair. "I'm just worried about James. Everything that's happening in the city. I don't know what to do anymore." "You can't keep worrying like this. You have to face the truth. Whether it's a bitter or sweet truth, it will help you understand everything better," Emma said softly, yet with weight in her voice. Rachel looked at her mother, knowing she was right. From the moment this ordeal began, they had been avoiding the truth. James and she had tried to protect themselves by gathering evidence without directly confronting what was happening. But perhaps it was time to face the reality of what was truly going on. Right after returning from her visit to her mother, Rachel and James decided they would no longer avoid the issue. They needed to face Walter once again and find a way to end everything. Though they knew confronting him wouldn't be easy, both understood that if they did nothing, they would never be able to live peacefully again. They decided to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, a place where James felt most comfortable talking without interruptions. That afternoon, As James arrived at the cafe, he couldn't shake the unusual tension in the air. All he wanted was a calm meeting, but he knew that was simply impossible now. Walter sat at a corner table, a cup of coffee in hand, his face serious. When he saw James walk in, he didn't smile or show any emotion. Everything between them had become far more complicated than before. "What do you want?" Walter asked coldly. James didn't waste any time. He got straight to the point. "I know what you've done. I have enough evidence to prove that you've threatened my family and caused harm to our lives." Walter didn't seem afraid. Instead, he looked at James with a defiant stare. "You think I'm scared of you? You can have all the evidence in the world. But if no one stands by your side, then all of it is just paper." James was resolute. "You may have power, but you can't control our lives forever. I won't be silent anymore. I will stand up and fight for what's right." Walter stared at James for a long time, his gaze heavy, then finally spoke, his tone softer. "You don't understand me. I do everything I need to do to protect my family, to protect this neighborhood. But you're not someone I can easily ignore." James was firmer than ever. "Honestly, I don't understand you. But I know one thing. I won't let you hurt my family. We will fight." The conversation ended with no concessions from Walter. However, James felt more motivated than ever to continue this fight. If necessary, he would take the matter to court and fight it out to the end. Although the meeting with Walter didn't yield immediate results, it helped James realize that Walter couldn't do anything when faced with a clear strategy and determination. This made James start thinking of stronger ways to protect his family. The next morning, James began preparing a series of action plans. He met with a lawyer to discuss filing a lawsuit and gathering more evidence. They looked into the legal conditions James could leverage, from collecting information to preparing for a long legal battle. Rachel didn't sit idly by either. She decided to follow Walter on her own, trying to find his weaknesses, even though she knew it wouldn't be an easy task. Every time Walter appeared in the neighborhood, Rachel was there, observing his every move. She noticed something suspicious. Walter often met with some strangers near the park. These meetings lasted for hours, and sometimes Rachel felt that something wasn't right. Finally, after gathering multiple pieces of information, Rachel discovered that the people Walter was meeting were actually partners in a large real estate project. These projects were aimed at pushing families like theirs out of the area where they lived. Immediately, James and Rachel decided to act. They contacted organizations that protect citizens' rights and began gathering evidence to expose the truth. If this plan succeeded, they wouldn't just protect their own family, but they could also help other residents avoid Walter's manipulative tactics. Finally, after several days of preparation, James and Rachel were ready to enter the real battle. They had gathered enough evidence, information, and determination to confront Walter once again. But this time, they wouldn't be alone. They had found allies willing to stand with them in the fight for justice. The first day of the official legal battle began when James filed the lawsuit with the court. The court demanded that both parties provide evidence, and James had security camera footage, recordings of threatening phone calls, and documents related to Walter's secret meetings with real estate partners. Walter couldn't sit quietly. He had enlisted his best lawyer to counter every accusation. But James and Rachel were not intimidated. They knew this fight was only just beginning. Day by day, the battle between James and Walter grew more intense than ever. Although James had filed the lawsuit and gathered a substantial amount of evidence, he still couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The legal system could be powerful, but it was also filled with loopholes that people with power, like Walter, could easily exploit. Every time James received a notice from the court, he felt an underlying anxiety. Would they have enough strength to fight someone like Walter, a man who always knew how to maneuver around the law? Meanwhile, Rachel was also fighting a battle within herself. She could sense the tension growing in the family, especially with Sophie. The little girl didn't fully understand what was going on, but the changes in the family's atmosphere made her feel uneasy. Rachel didn't want her family to go through another crisis like this, but she also understood that if they didn't fight, everything they had would be taken away. One late afternoon, as Rachel was tending to Sophie in the living room, James' phone suddenly rang. She looked at him and saw a hint of concern in his eyes as he glanced at the screen. "What's going on?" Rachel asked. James placed the phone down on the table, deep in thought as he looked at his wife. "It's a call from our lawyer. They just got information that Walter has been trying to influence some of our witnesses. He's trying to silence everyone." A cold shiver ran down Rachel's spine. She knew Walter wasn't an easy opponent, but his determination had now crossed all limits. They couldn't stop fighting, but every step they took could lead them into danger. James and Rachel knew they couldn't fight this battle alone. They understood that, in order to win, they needed reliable allies, people who would support them not only legally but also emotionally. They decided to expand their support network and seek out individuals with shared goals. One of the first people they thought of was Thomas, James' old friend. Thomas was a well-known investigative journalist, experienced in handling high-profile cases, particularly those involving corruption and abuse of power. He had the ability to uncover information that others would never think to look for. That afternoon, James made a call to Thomas. "James, I've heard about what's going on, and I want to help. I can assist you in gathering more evidence and bringing this story to light. What Walter is doing has to be stopped," Thomas said, his voice filled with determination. Rachel overheard the conversation and felt the same resolve from Thomas. She nodded, trusting that his support would help them gather stronger evidence. "We really need your help, Thomas. We'll need you to investigate more about Walter's relationships and his activities." "Of course, I'll do everything I can," Thomas replied. At the same time, they also received support from a nonprofit organization that protected the rights of citizens. This organization had previously fought cases of corruption and injustice, and they decided to stand with James and Rachel. With the backing of these organizations, both of them felt a renewed sense of confidence in their path toward victory. The legal battle was never easy, and day by day, James and Rachel felt the mounting pressure they had to face. Walter wasn't just using his financial power to overpower them, but also manipulating those in positions of power within the system. Despite having solid evidence, Walter's dirty tactics forced them to confront unexpected challenges. One of the most concerning developments was the disappearance of one of their key witnesses. Jonathan, a person who had witnessed Walter's shady meetings with real estate partners, suddenly became unreachable. James and Rachel grew increasingly worried as they realized these individuals might have been threatened or even bribed to stay silent and not testify. When James visited an old friend, a former police officer with connections to people in the industry, he learned that Walter had recruited former cops to work for him. These individuals could be tracking their every move, helping Walter cover up his wrongdoings. "We need to be careful, James. Walter not only has money but also ties to people within this system. You need to consider every possibility," his old friend warned. James felt a heavy sense of worry weighing on him, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let Walter continue harming his family and those around him. A week later, as James and Rachel were preparing for the next hearing, they received the news that Jonathan had been kidnapped. Neither of them could sit idly by. They decided they had to find a way to rescue Jonathan and keep fighting. Everything had now become too tense. James and Rachel knew that if they didn't act immediately, Walter would win. All they could do was resolve to go all the way, no matter the danger. That day, as the next hearing was about to take place, James and Rachel were ready with all the evidence they had. But before they could speak, they received an unexpected call. Jonathan had escaped, but he was injured and needed help. Without hesitation, James and Rachel immediately called a car and headed to the location where Jonathan was being hidden. They couldn't let Walter continue to operate in the shadows. Both were determined not to stop until every truth was revealed. The rescue of Jonathan was successful, but they also realized that time was running out. Everything was entering its most critical stage. Nothing could stop this battle now, and James, Rachel, and their allies were ready to face the final confrontation with Walter. James and Rachel's story was now approaching a critical turning point. After rescuing Jonathan, everything became more tense than ever. Jonathan, though only slightly injured, confirmed that Walter wasn't just using his power to manipulate the media and the legal system, but also had dark connections in the underground world. The people Walter had threatened were too afraid to speak out, fearing the unforeseeable consequences. "We can't just sit on the sidelines and wait for things to happen," James said, his eyes filled with determination as he stood in the living room with Rachel and Thomas. "If we don't act immediately, everything we've done will be in vain." Rachel looked at her husband, unable to hide her worry. "We've done everything we can, James, but if we're not careful, he'll hurt us, or at least find a way to sabotage our plans." James looked directly into his wife's eyes. "No, Rachel, we can't back down. It's time to face Walter. We have to find a way to break through all his disguises." The upcoming confrontation would not only be a legal battle but also a psychological one. James and Rachel knew they had to be prepared for the worst-case scenario. They decided to inform their legal team and allies that they would take action during the next hearing. This was the moment to gather all their strength and expose the truth about Walter before justice. The entire family prepared for this battle with unwavering resolve. Meanwhile, Walter could sense the mounting tension in the air. It seemed as though he had realized that things were no longer going the way he had planned. The day of the hearing had arrived. James and Rachel woke up early, preparing for the most important legal battle of their lives. While Rachel got Sophie and the children ready, James was in his office with the lawyers and Thomas, reviewing the evidence and making sure everything was in place. They couldn't afford to miss any details, as even a small mistake could cost them their last chance. "What's the plan?" Thomas asked, his eyes lighting up as he looked at the files they had gathered. "We'll start by presenting all of Walter's connections to illegal organizations, the powerful figures he's manipulated." James replied, "We won't let Walter justify his actions. All the evidence will be brought into the open." Thomas nodded, a faint smile appearing on his face. "Right, but we also need to prepare for the unexpected. Walter is a very cunning person. I don't believe he'll let us win easily." Rachel entered the office, her expression filled with concern. "We have to win, James, not just for us, but for everyone Walter has hurt." "I know, Rachel, and I won't let that happen," James said firmly, taking his wife's hand. The hearing began in the afternoon. James and Rachel stood before the court, alongside their lawyers, while Walter sat on the other side, his face cold and self-assured. The witnesses, those who had once been threatened by Walter, started to take the stand, each one telling what they knew. James could feel the tension in the air. The irrefutable evidence was being presented step by step. But Walter showed no signs of concern. In fact, he even smiled. "This is not going to be an easy fight," James whispered. While the legal battle was ongoing in the courtroom, Walter had begun to employ more sophisticated tactics to undermine James and Rachel's position. One of his notable moves was to make counteraccusations, complicating the situation further. Walter claimed that James had committed a crime by infiltrating the confidential documents of organizations connected to him. In an attempt to damage his reputation, Walter succeeded in making James's lawyers confused, raising doubts about the legality of the investigation. "He won't give up easily, will he?" Rachel said, looking at James as they left the courthouse at the end of the day. "No, he won't stop, but we've prepared for this. The evidence we've gathered is still very strong. Walter can't hide the truth forever." Still, James felt uneasy. Walter's tactics were becoming more dangerous. Not only were there false accusations, but Walter was also resorting to lies and information manipulation to discredit them. James knew that this was the point where things would get tense and unpredictable. The two of them decided not to let Walter's accusations shake their resolve. They had to stand firm and continue fighting for justice. At last, after many days of struggle, the hearing was drawing to a close. Both James and Rachel could feel the mounting tension. Walter's tactics, though temporarily shaking their confidence, could not deny the fact that they had gathered enough evidence to expose all of his crimes. "Just one more step," James said, his eyes filled with determination. "We have to bring this battle to its conclusion." Rachel looked at her husband, sensing the exhaustion but also the unwavering resolve in his eyes. "You've done everything you could. If it weren't for you, we wouldn't be standing here today. We're doing this for justice." "Rachel," James replied, taking her hand, "and if we win, it will be a victory for all those who have been oppressed." The next day, they prepared for the final move in the lawsuit. James had contacted the authorities to gather the last pieces of evidence they needed. With the support of Thomas and their associates, they were ready to bring all the truths to light. Everything now depended on a decisive battle, one that was not only about legalities but also about ideals and justice. James, Rachel, and their family were ready to face the greatest challenges of their lives. Walter, despite using every means to protect his power and wealth, now had to face an undeniable truth.